It's a pleasure to meet everybody in the call. And today I'll be talking about the South African National Plastics Hotspotting. It's an interesting activity that we implemented in the past 1.5 years. And I'll be highlighting the results of that and how that contributes to shaping action on the basis of South Africa or within the South African context. So I'll start by doing an introduction of our organization, IUCN, for those who may not be familiarized, then go briefly into what we do with the MARPLASTICCs Project, and then lastly delve deeper into the hotspotting assessment. So for the benefit of those who might have low bandwidth, I'll stop my video and at least get everybody to follow the presentation. So IUCN, as most of you might know, is one of the oldest, or actually the oldest environmental conservation organization in the world, established more than 72 years ago. And our vision is quite simple and straightforward, that we aim to have a just world that values and conserves nature. So we have a number of regional offices across 11 locations globally, with presence in about 50 countries across the globe. So within the Eastern and Southern African region, we have offices in Nairobi, Mozambique, South Africa, and we are still growing and expanding to other countries. Yeah, so what do we do? So what we do is we do implement a number of projects in various areas, from freshwater, biodiversity, wildlife, marine, and coastal conservation. And through these projects, we do generate a lot of data and information that we go into the extra step of analyzing, and with that produce recommendations for various policymakers at different scales, be it national, regional, or global. And then this is used to set the conservation agenda globally. So the other thing we do is we do convene global platforms for different stakeholders to at least help us chart the conservation agenda for the different types of ecosystems going forward. And in September, we'll be convening such a forum in the name of the World Conservation Congress. So maybe some of you might have an opportunity to attend or participate. So I'll go straight into the MARPLASTICCs Initiative, which is a fairly young initiative, about 3 years old. And the initiative was basically conceived to assist countries and regional bodies and partners and stakeholders with at least necessary tools to help understand the plastics problem at scale, and the necessary knowledge and understanding and capacity to be able to respond effectively in terms of addressing the problem. But we also do undertake policy and economic analysis to basically inform the viability of the various recommendations and propositions that we put forth. And lastly, we do engage with business to also attain some success or maybe accelerate business innovation to be able to minimize plastic leakage. So you can see the 4 pillars there. So I'll go into the first pillar briefly. So on the very far left, one of the things we do is we do generate knowledge and tools that helps countries and stakeholders and partners to be able to implement better actions to address the plastics problem. So on the left, we have a publication that we released in 2019 that provides a very good review of some of the existing methodologies across the globe, be it LCA methodologies or environmental footprinting methodologies, to at least help identify the abundance and distribution, type, sources, as well as different pathways and sinks of plastic pollution at different scales. And then in the middle is guidance that we produced last year, and it's published in the URL outlined or shared below. So it's a guidance that outlines a methodological framework that helps countries fill the gap on plastic flows, and also in terms of understanding leakage across all value chains through undertaking a comprehensive science policy kind of assessment. So I'll talk briefly also about that in coming slides. And what you see on the right side of the image is the covers of the various reports or national plastic hotspotting assessments that we've already been able to produce in Kenya, Mozambique, South Africa, Thailand, and Vietnam. So within the capacity pillar, in the context of South Africa, we've partnered with Wide Oceans, which is an organization that you all know, based in KZN, or KwaZulu-Natal province. And they do quite interesting work in conserving the oceans. And one of the activities they implement is they try to minimize the amount of plastic that enters into the Durban Bay. And so through this project, we're trying to restore the Durban Bay to a very healthy and viable ecosystem that supports wildlife and biodiversity to almost or near a natural state, how it used to be before human intervention. And the Durban Bay is significant because that's where we have the Durban port, which is one of the busiest port harbors in South Africa. So the project has been able to record some significant success, where within the past 1 year, we've been able to at least prevent about 30,000 kilograms of plastic waste from entering into the marine environment, which is great. And I think scaling up such action will give us even better results. So on the policy front, we've produced a number of products. We've looked at different policy and regulatory frameworks in South Africa and how best is suited in addressing the mitigation of plastic pollution in the marine environment. And more recently, what you see on the right side is an unreleased publication that we are just trying to wrap up that has actually looked at supporting South Africa through its journey in putting forth an extended producer responsibility framework, from a policy to regulatory framework, to at least enable the sector players to implement a mandatory EPR more effectively. And we've given some importance to the informal sector and looking how that can be implemented or integrated into the EPR mechanism at the national level. We've also done an economic analysis in Cape Town, where we try to look at the efficacy of beach cleanups and a depository fund scheme for plastics in mitigating plastic pollution and with view to its implications on the tourism sector. So there's additional studies now that have spurred, for example, by the CSIR, to scale up such kind of work at the national level. Then on the business front, we've tried to partner with businesses. So I'll just point to an event we had last November, where we had about 26 different private companies, big names that you might know or identify from the slide that is in front of you, to basically try to promote the application of the plastic leak project, a footprinting methodology that helps companies either understand the usage, wastage, and leakage of plastic leakage across all value chains, or even for specific priority product streams that maybe are problematic to their consumers. And so jumping into the hotspotting assessment, I'll highlight that the methodology we used is developed using open science principles. So it's basically open for use and application by any stakeholders out there, including the students we might have within the call. So everything, the modules, the computational tools, they're all like freely available for anybody to apply in any different national setting or jurisdiction. So the methodology is developed in conjunction or partnership with UNEP and the Life Cycle Initiative. And we've worked with Quantis and Environmental Action, or EA, that are based in Europe to develop this particular methodology. So as you see on the right image, in very brief terms, the methodology is structured into 2 streams. We have a technical stream where you undertake all the technical work and data collection and analysis to basically outline very clear and specific hotspots that then translate into the strategic stream. So at the strategic stream, this is an engagement stream with stakeholders where we discuss and engage on different types of interventions that could be suitably and cost-effectively implemented in the context of South Africa. And then from there, we try to converge across a number of instruments to really enable that to happen, the implementation of those interventions to happen. And so what the hotspotting found in South Africa is quite interesting, and it's different from a lot of other sub-Saharan African countries, at least when we implemented this, like Mozambique and Kenya. So in South Africa, we find that there's a very high collection rate of plastic waste at 70%. In a lot of the other countries, we are finding about 40-something to about 50% collection. So South Africa has indeed put some effort in trying to recover a lot of plastic that is waste. But then from that, only about 14% gets recycled domestically. But then one thing I need to put in perspective is, in as much as we collect 70% of the waste, plastic waste, the country generates 2.4 million tons of plastic waste annually. And then the waste generation per capita or per person per year is around 41 kilograms, which is significantly higher than the global average, which is around 29 kilograms per capita per year. And so all the other waste that is not collected, either waste that is left in the environment, littering, or waste that goes to unsanitary landfills or dump sites, all that is categorized as mismanaged waste. And that is 40% of the 2.4 million tons of plastic waste that is generated annually, which is quite significant. And from the mismanaged component, we then go further to compute the leakage component of that. That is the component of plastic waste that ends up in waterways and in the ocean. And in the case of South Africa, we find about 80,000 tons do leak annually into the oceans and waterways, which is also quite significant compared to, let's say, Kenya and Mozambique, which is more like less than half of what South Africa emits. And then microplastic leakage is important in the context of South Africa because given the high number of cars and tire abrasion on South Africa's very nice roads or road infrastructure, about 8% of the plastic leakage in South Africa emanates from microplastic leakage from tire abrasion, which is interesting because we don't see that, for example, in the case of Mozambique, which has very few cars and like tire industry. And then, so what we do with the hotspots is, hotspots in this case are not the typical traditional hotspots as we've seen maybe in other jurisdictions, but we take a more broader definition of hotspots and define them as like stages or points within the value chain that can at least result in some form of leakage or related impacts. So we analyze 5 types of hotspots. We look at polymers, different types of plastic polymers. We look at different types of uses or applications of plastics. We look at different sectors, and then we look at different stages of the waste management hierarchy. And lastly, we also look at the geographical or regional partition to identify where a lot of the plastic emanates. So as an overview, what we found in terms of polymers, we saw that LD and PET are amongst the highest contributors in absolute terms of plastic leakage. But then synthetic fiber, synthetic rubber, and PP become important in the context of relative leakage or leakage rate. So they have quite a high rate of leakage, even though the absolute in terms of tons is quite lower than the first two. And then we've looked at different hotspots across the value chain, and you can see that in the middle, but I'll elaborate that in a further slide. And then in terms of geographical, we've seen that just a few of the major towns, we're talking about Durban, Pretoria, Joburg, Cape Town, and related coastal towns, those ones play a significant role in contributing to plastic leakage into the oceans. So I'll just highlight maybe 2 or 3 hotspots so that you at least get a glimpse of what we do. So on the polymer hotspot, what happens first is the analysis tries to understand the mass balance of plastic. So you try to account for all the plastic that enters into South Africa or is produced within South Africa. And then once you have that sort of tonnage, on the output side of things, you try to partition it in terms of what goes into stock, for example, in buildings or in motor vehicles, what goes into different types of products. And ultimately, what is important is what goes into the waste component of it. So from the waste component, you then delve deeper into trying to understand the mismanaged component of that, because part of it goes to recycling. And from the mismanaged, you try to understand the leakage rate. So going through that cascade, we find that LDPE, PP, and PET are very important in South Africa as some of the biggest contributors of plastic leakage in the ocean and waterways. But then what you find about synthetic rubber is, in as much as the volumes that enter the ocean are not so significant, it has a very high leakage rate, more than the others, of about 6%, as you can see on the graph. And a lot of this is elaborated in the report, which you can download in the URL that I shared earlier. So on the application side of things, we find that PET bottles, and mostly because of its widespread use, is a significant contributor of leakage in South Africa, contributing about 8,000 tons of plastic. But what you see also that is interesting is that the leakage rate for PET bottles is also low compared to, for example, things like cigarette filters or baby diapers. And the reason for that has to do with the significant recycling that happens in South Africa. Because as you know, South Africa has a significant or vibrant recycling sector as compared to a lot of African or sub-Saharan African countries. And then in addition to these two hotspots, we have the sector hotspot and the regional hotspot, which I wouldn't go into, but you're free to look at the report to better understand them. And then maybe the last one, which is slightly different, is the waste management hotspot, where we try to look at the different stages of waste management, from source, collection, and infrastructure-related components to end of life, and identify some critical areas where maybe South Africa can invest a bit more of its resources and energy in terms of addressing. So what you see on the slide in red, I'm not so sure whether you can read clearly, but plastic waste generation per capita in South Africa is quite high, as I pointed out earlier, higher than the global average. And then the share of plastic in waste stream is also significantly high. So those are two elements within the source category that we can look into in terms of addressing the waste management shortcomings. And then on the collection side of things, you see a number of cells there that are in red, or I don't know whether it's pink color. So issues around segregation of compostable waste from waste, at least to minimize contamination of plastic waste, and segregation of recyclable plastics, formal collection of municipal waste, value of recycled plastics, and value of non-recycled plastics. So these are all areas that need to be looked into. And within the context of South Africa, there is a number of interventions that are already going on. Like, for example, the working groups established under the Plastic Colloquium, which are looking into the bottlenecks in all these different areas within the waste management hierarchy in trying to propose improvements and investments to at least get South Africa to a better position than it is right now. And then there are interventions at the end of life stage, where the frequency of city cleaning and sweeping is an important hotspot. And it's important because in especially highly dense townships, if cleaning is not done more frequently, then you find bins, in as much as they are a bit bigger than what we find in most unpopulated homesteads, they fill up so quickly. And when they're uncollected, then there's a lot of spilling over and wind blowing of plastic all over into the streets and into nearby waterways. And so what we do from all these different analyses is to formulate very clear sentences which are actionable hotspots that the government and other partners can look at in terms of trying to see where they can gain some entry point to effectively address or tackle specific hotspots that have been identified. So in the context of South Africa, we formulated 14 actionable hotspots. I wouldn't go into all of them because you can see the listing on the or in the report. I'll just highlight that the first one, what you see on the source side of things, number one has to do with the plastic per capita waste generation in South Africa, which is quite high, greater than the global average. And then if we go to, for example, the right side, number 9, you find that it relates to a lot of plastic and all plastics basically leaking in rural and peri-urban areas because of low collection rates, especially in informal settlements. And then you find there's certain hotspots like number 7, which cross-cuts all the different stages of plastic. And this relates to the low demand of recycled material on the domestic market, which really doesn't provide a very good incentive for either collectors or the recycling sector to scale up their actions. And so these actionable hotspots basically help us to define interventions. And in the interventions, we've tried to categorize them into the kind of consequences they have. So some of them might have some high consequences which are maybe negative, like for example, maybe leading to unemployment or loss of jobs and such, which is not something that South Africa envisages at this point in time, which is very difficult for the economy. So if you look at these, on the horizontal axis or x-axis, we have unintended consequences, and on the left or y-axis, we have the leakage mitigation potential. So the aim really is to target interventions at the top row and mostly trying to move far right. So for example, on the very top right quadrant, we see that increasing plastic segregation at the household level and segregation in public spaces, and also ensuring plastic waste has enough value to cover collection costs. These three are quite significant because they result in very low unintended consequences, which are negative. But then on the very left side, something like promoting the design of materials that substitute plastic and that have been informed by some very elaborate life cycle assessments. It has some high impact or consequences, but then the mitigation potential of leakage is quite high. So we have a number of these interventions that are being proposed. They are not cast in stones, but these are just propositions based on the hotspot results that then stakeholders within the country can look at and reflect on the context that we have in terms of maybe trying to determine which one we pursue now, maybe in the short term and in a very cost-effective manner. And then once our interventions are defined, then we work again through multi-stakeholder forums that bring in the government and private sector and other stakeholders to at least try to identify a number of instruments that can help us address specific hotspots or a number of hotspots. And I think the key message here is that no one size fits all. So it's not as straightforward as saying, okay, let's implement extended producer responsibility mechanism in South Africa, and that will help us resolve the problem. It won't. So the reality is that it's important to explore a number of instruments that touch on, for example, raising awareness and education around the plastics and which ones are recyclable and all these things, to developing knowledge for people to understand, for example, the implications of using certain plastics or just plastics overall. So a lot of capacity building for different types of stakeholders for them to play their roles within the whole cycle of plastic. And then also not forgetting economic and policy and regulatory incentives or tools to addressing the problem. So all these, when it comes to interventions and instruments, nothing is cast on stones. It's a very good overview of what South Africa could consider in terms of moving forward. And within the year, we'll be engaging in a number of forums and partnership meetings to try see what we could pick out from this cocktail in terms of actually implementing that at scale within South Africa. So I think with that, I'll say tak skal duha for those joining from Norway, and for those who speak Zulu, Diabonga, and for those who speak Afrikaans, thank you very much. So my name is Peter Manyara. I'm the Regional Project Officer for the MARPLASTICCs Project within the Eastern and Southern Africa region, and our contacts are included there. So thank you very much, and back to Tara.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. We've had a few questions come through ahead of time and in the chat. The first one is, where will the funding come from to implement the 4 pathways to impact knowledge, capacity, policy, and business that come out of the MARPLASTICCs project?
Yeah, so maybe to just take a step back, I'll go back to maybe giving a basis for the MARPLASTICCs project. We are funded by SIDA, which is the Swedish International Development Agency. And so what SIDA did is provide us the foundational funds to be able to start understanding the plastic problem within the countries that our priority countries, which is Thailand, Vietnam, Kenya, Mozambique, and South Africa. So this funding is not really intended to implement the various interventions that have been proposed. But at this initial phase of the project, which ended actually last year in December, and that has been extended partly to December this year, is to basically put all this knowledge on the table and to formulate very formidable action plans that then we can work with different stakeholders, not just IUCN as itself, but a number of partners across South Africa, to basically mobilize funding from across the world to implement or help us implement at least the most strategic hotspots that we've seen from the presentation that I delivered. So there's still much work to do ahead, and all of you will definitely play a significant role in getting us to progress or move forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Peter. There was a question from Anna B that says, what is the 79 KT leakage mentioned? Is that the estimate for South Africa? Because it's about the equivalent of 10% of the total plastics packaging in the country.
Yep. Yeah, so maybe I'll highlight that the leakage rate that we found for South Africa in terms of plastics, which is about 80,000 tons per year, is a bit low, maybe compared to what was put forth by the Jambek study some years back. But it's what the analysis, and based on all the data that we obtained from South Africa, including from ANABI, a lot of the industry material organizations across the country, from government, and a lot of the experts. So based on that computation, that's how we arrived at the 80,000 tons per year. But from a previous forum that we had, I think it was pointed out that that figure will actually be low, and the real leakage rate in South Africa will actually be a bit higher. So what you find in the report, we've also tried to highlight an alternate scenario based on a different kind of data set that projects the higher leakage rate. And there's a slide within the report that insinuates to that.
Thanks, Peter. Anabi sent a comment in the chat saying thank you. There's a comment from Carl that says, great, Peter, thanks. Could you please comment on a comparison of the different pilot countries?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think South Africa stands out. If we look at the 5 countries across the globe, including Thailand and Vietnam, South Africa tends to fall or align closely with Thailand and Vietnam, which have significant plastics industries and industries in general that produce lots of products that are exported to the neighboring countries within the respective regions, be it the Eastern and Southern Africa region or in Southeast Asia. So the leakage rate for South Africa, for example, is 80,000 kilotons per year. If you go to Kenya, it's about 37,000 tons, and Mozambique is about 20. 24 or 29,000 tons. So the factors that underlie the high leakage rates in these different countries are also important to consider, because in the context of South Africa, for example, they have at least a very good infrastructure for waste management and recycling. But then the problem is that the waste generation rate of plastic waste is not matching the capacity that we have as a country. And in Mozambique, in as much as collection is a bit low, where you find about 90 something percent of waste falls under the mismanaged waste category, meaning that almost all the plastic waste that is collected in Mozambique is either ending up in unregulated or unsanitary landfills. A lot of it goes into unregulated dump sites across the country. And then there's a lot of it just littering the streets. So basically what you're saying, other than the very small percentage, less than 1% that is recycled, and a lot of it actually exported from outside the country for recycling elsewhere, the bulk of Mozambique's plastic waste, irrespective of which compartment it ends up in, is likely to leak to the environment. So the dynamic there is different and not so similar to South Africa.
Thanks, Peter. It's very interesting to have an overview of the comparison between the different countries. I don't see any more comments or questions coming through in the chat or the Q&A box. Please feel free to send through your questions there. There's a comment from Carl that says, do you have any advice on what or how this could be done in Norway?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So I think following the assessment we implemented in these 5 countries, there's been a lot of requests from additional countries. So at this point in time, I think we have maybe 2 or 3 countries from South America and the Caribbean, and we have additional countries from Asia, and we're also finalizing implementation of the same in Manyara and Cyprus. So what we find is a lot of these countries that are putting forth these requests are mostly maybe within the not so developed countries. And so it will be interesting even for us to have this exercise implemented in a developed country like Norway, which will likely maybe have like very opposite results from a lot of the countries we've looked at. And anything is possible, Carl. So there are 2 implementation pathways where experts within the country could actually utilize the methodology as is and use the tools and modules that have been provided and the guidance to actually pilot this assessment in Norway. But then the other option is also we could explore through the consultants who helped us develop the methodology and the tools to maybe implement through them. But I think, yeah, anybody can do it. It can either be done within the country or using external experts. Nothing limits us from doing that.
Thanks, Peter. There's a question from Dostane that says, thank you. The 14 actionable hotspots, are they available to see or view the list and see how collaboration between stakeholders can take place?
Yes, thank you very much, Dao, and all the industry stakeholders that you represent that are maybe within the call. So all the results of the assessment are in public domain. They are within the report, and I've previously shared the report with all the stakeholders. But if you go to Google and search for MARPLASTICCs or Close the Plastic Tab program for IUCN, you'll be taken to a knowledge products page, which has all these different reports and additional reports that I didn't highlight here, or that will be developed in maybe coming months. So everything is included there. Like we don't hold back anything. Everything is for stakeholders to use.
Thanks, Peter. I see Carl has raised his hand. Carl, you should be able to unmute now.
Thanks, Peter. Very interesting. And we'll certainly look into how we can do this in a Norwegian context. Appreciate your comments.
Sure, thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Then Doe sent a message through saying, thanks, Peter. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or the chat, but if anyone does have any questions at a later stage, you're welcome to either email those through to webinars@SST Africa or to contact Peter directly. I think you did have your contact details up there earlier on, Peter, if you're happy with that.
Yes.
Then there is another question in the chat that says, I might have missed something, but what was the source of all the data presented?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And first of all, maybe before I answer it, I'll have to say that unlike most of the countries we've worked in the region, that is Kenya and Mozambique, South Africa is uniquely placed in that the country has been looking at the plastics pollution issue for a longer time. And so with that, there's a number of assessments or studies and analysis that have taken place through different types of partners, be it consultants or research institutions. And so there's enormous amount of resources. And so what our analysis also tries to do is look at all these different results or outputs of various initiatives and try to create some coherency. So in the case of this specific assessment, in addition to looking at all the various studies that have taken place in South Africa, we also reached out to a number of agencies or organizations or umbrella bodies, including from industry, like Plastics SA, the Polystyrene Association of South Africa, government departments, and a lot of other experts, like the Moss Group and others, to basically get a glimpse into the different types of analysis they've done and the kind of results they are getting, and try to create some coherency across all these different and varied data. So if you go to the report, at the very last pages, we do include tables of all the different data that we obtain. But in addition, also we provide like a quality assessment matrix, which actually highlights specific data. And for example, the specific reports or studies or even institutions that is associated with that particular data. So all that is included in the report. And we also analyze for, like, from a quality perspective, how like accurate is this particular type of data that we got from this particular stakeholder. There's a whole like comprehensive data quality assessment or analysis criterion that has been developed, and it's also available online.
Thank you, Peter. There have been a few comments that say thank you and thanks for the great presentation. I don't see any more questions, but there was a comment from that last question saying thanks for expanding. They'll take a look at the reports and references. Then there's another question that says, what is the exact name of the report you're referring to?
Yeah, so the exact name of the report is National Plastics Hotspotting Shaping Action. It's also included in one of the slides with the exact cover page for the report.
Thanks, Peter. Once the recording of this webinar is uploaded, we will attach a PDF version of the slides as well for people to use as a reference.
Sure, thank you.
In the meantime, I think we can close it here for today. And as I don't see any other questions, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you, particularly Peter, for taking the time to chat with us today and presenting on this remarkable project.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for listening and for your participation and for the opportunity to share.
Of course. This will be available again on our YouTube page and our SST websites, and we will be hosting regular weekly webinars at the same time each week. So keep a lookout for the next link and the next presentation. Thanks so much, everyone.